So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are located. This is a panel number 2, a very exciting panel indeed. We'll be discussing anything related to the transfer of science to policy, the policy science or science policy interface, if you wish, as they relate to transboundary aquifers globally. So I have the privilege to be moderating this session. My name is Alfonso Rivera. I am the chairman of the International Association of Hydrogeologists Transboundary Aquifers Commission. And I'm here to moderate in a discussion that is promising, very promising in the sense of being very rich. I also privileged, have invited and everyone accepted my invitations to sit here on the table and discuss this exciting subject. I will introduce them one by one in detail in a moment, but for the moment, just let me tell you that fortunately, all the 4 panelists that are invited accepted. So I have with me the pleasure of having here Rosario Sanchez from the Texas A&M University. I won't introduce fully, later on I will. I have Shami Puri also sitting here with me. You don't see him in the moment. You might in a minute. We have Mr. Ed Rosina, a former commissioner. Also, thank you so much so early in the morning for you, I know. And as well as Anders Jägerskon. I don't know if I pronounce your name correctly, Anders, you let me know. So without much other things to say, and there are many, I would like to begin by making a short introduction on what it is about, and so the public knows what we are going to do over the next 44 minutes, the procedure that we want to do. So this is not a formal presentation, oral presentation. This is a discussion. So please bear with me. There will be 4 questions previously asked, and each of the panelists will answer one of them. We will be more or less sharp in times with 5-6 minutes-ish. And the reason is simply because it is a discussion and we would like to involve the public. So we would like to have the public to ask questions to the panelists, which I will address to each one of them after their statements, of course. So all in all, I estimate to have something between 12-14 minutes for question and answers. And following that, the panel will disappear. Now, the focus of this panel is on bridging the science policy interface for informed decisions in policy making under the transboundary aquifer context. In a nutshell, that's what it is. Now, I like to add that transboundary aquifers need to be managed like any other aquifer, right? But in this case, it requires joint approaches and greater degree of collaboration on a regular basis. That makes a difference for once. Now, the principles apply and the procedures need to be agreed upon and aligned with international best practice, guided by international law and practice according to specific cooperation agreements on the particular aquifer. And if you have been following the conference, you have heard, I'm sure, that these are essential in terms of cooperating. Now, this panel will explore means on how science may contribute to the shared management of transboundary aquifers and how we may enhance the dialogue between groundwater sciences and groundwater management. We also would like to discuss whether or not we are able at this point in time to accelerate the transfer of transboundary science into policy. So that's what it is about. Let me begin then. Oh, by the way, the questions that I will ask will be also written in the chat for so the public will also always know which question we are addressing, right? So let me begin with Rosario Sanchez. Give me a second. Rosario is the leader of the Transboundary Aquifer Assessment Act program in the USA, which integrates research and data on transboundary aquifers between Mexico and Texas. She is the director of the Permanent Forum on Binational Waters and leads the transboundary groundwater research team of the Texas Water Resources Institute at Texas A&M University. Well, Rosario has quite a lot of experience, 20 years of academic and work experience in transboundary issues between Mexico and the USA. So I thought that it will be adequate to ask Rosario the first question, which is the following. Please, Rosario, can you tell us how can science contribute to the shared management of TBAs? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alfonso. Good morning here, good afternoon there, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to share this panel with people that I actually admire a lot and that I follow. And thank you for having me here today. So when you were talking about your introduction, and please let me know when my time is up or 1 minute before my time is up, so I can wrap up.
I will.
You were talking about policy, informing policy, and what are the implications for that at transboundary level. And you also mentioned international law. So I'm going to come back to that because that's important. Because this is not just about science anymore. It's not just about the physical aspect of what groundwater or aquifers is. This is much more challenging than that. Now, we all know we need science, and we heard yesterday that we cannot monitor anything that we don't know. It's hard to manage water if we don't have the science behind it. That's a fact, that's a given, and we all understand that. Now, but what type of science are we talking about here? What is the quality of science? What do we mean by science at transboundary level? Do we need to think about priorities at national level or at binational or international level? Transboundary issues and basically transboundary groundwater issues go beyond borders, and we know that. But the fact that transcends borders, that means we have extra challenges to deal with. And those challenges has another different interfaces in the international arena, especially international law. Concepts as sovereignty, self-determination, all those strong paradigms at the international relations arena are in shock. We are shocking them with this topic. They feel shocked, and countries are kind of challenged itself. And the policy process is being challenged itself as it is asked to address those issues at transboundary level without considering those main principles, strong principles that govern power relations in the world. So we need to start thinking about sharing. What is the concept of sharing means? What is the concept of shared science means? And what does that implies at transboundary level? It requires, if you think about it, just sharing data at transboundary level, that's a policy process itself. I mean, it's not easy to share science. It requires effective communication. It requires involvement of formal and informal institutions. It requires build trust. It requires capacity building. It requires institutional leadership. And that's driven within the policy process making itself. So if we think about it, we need to think about it the other way around. Is what type of science, what are the questions that we're trying to answer when we think about science? And think about policy making. What is the science that policy making requires in order to make this more effective at transboundary level? And we as scientists, we don't usually think that way. We produce science and we ask the policymakers to listen to ourselves without actually thinking what they have to listen first and what are the priorities first. Now, what priorities? National priorities or transboundary priorities? International priorities? Transboundary issues, not just water issues, requires a more holistic approach on priorities, because now we can't think about the boundaries of our countries alone in order to address the challenges that we're facing today. So that's a shock. And I just want to mention that that's a shock to the current paradigm, and we need to change, and we need to start putting ourselves, putting some words out there in a way that we need to understand what this actually means for international relations, basically. And we need to start thinking about that first, and then try to accommodate how we interrelate with each other in order to make science useful. Because
you have 1 minute, Rosario. 1 minute.
Yes, thank you. Oh, it goes so fast. So I'm going to wrap up here. We need to think about what the sharing concept means at international level. We need to think about how policy is actually fed by our results, by scientists' results, which is naturally fitted by informal and formal protocols and strategies used to produce transboundary research. Communication, trust, and leadership. Those are 3 elements that need to be worked out at the beginning of any scientific project at transboundary level. And the third, think about what is the minimum data necessary to make a decision at transboundary level. Why is that? Because we all have heard there's limited data. There's a problem with data. There's a problem with sharing data. Okay, we know that. What can we do what we have already? And what is the minimum amount of data that we need in order to make a robust decision? So think about it more in a mathematical way. I have a lot of incognitas around. So what can I do with the data that we have, instead of just producing data for this or science for the sake of producing science? Let's try to answer the questions that we need to answer. And the priorities are our countries and our system. Let's not just talk about countries. This is a system needs for us.
Well, thank you so much, Rosario. I had to stop you here. Your time, you're good. It's only 30 seconds over time, so that's great.
Okay, I'm done.
Thank you so much. I just say one word because there's no time. The essential of your talk, and there are many good things that I think we can extract from your reply to this question. But I guess the essential is the paradigm shift, and I would like to come back later. Thank you so much again, Rosario.
You're welcome.
All right. All right. So we will continue as expected. And this time, let me introduce formally, let me go 1 second here. Formally introduce Mr. Edward Drusina, who served as the United States Commissioner for the United States section of the International Boundary and Water Commission for over 8 years. As commissioner, Mr. Drusina envisaged the enormous need to get control of the aquifers along the US-Mexico border. The IBWC, as is known, was very successful, actually, in better managing the surface waters of the Colorado River and the Rio Grande under the 1944 treaty. And he believed at the time, and I guess he believes still, that we must find a way to do it for the many aquifers along the US-Mexico border, as we did it for the Colorado River. So once again, thank you so much, Mr. Drusina, and the floor is yours for the next 5 to 6 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Rivera. Well, the question is, how should we enhance dialogue between groundwater scientists and groundwater managers? So that's a very good question. But to better understand it, we need to try to define those 2 positions. A scientist pursues and applies knowledge and an understanding of the natural and social world following more of a systematic methodology based on evidence, whereas a groundwater manager weighs the outcome of his responsibility, I believe, based on the availability of the water. Water managers are mostly, I think, outcome focused. They have to consider not only the availability of the water, the resource, but they also have to overcome the necessary to sustain it in their social and economic needs of whatever area they live in. You know, I'm an engineer, so I tend to lean towards following the science when confronted with a lot of difficult situations. But the reality is there's a lot of way to address a problem. And I certainly recognize that there are, social and economic factors that must be taken into consideration before moving forward on anything. Let me just start by saying that, but if groundwater managers are not listening to groundwater scientists, well, guess what? You're going to end up with serious problems. You're going to end up with a discord with not only within your agency, but perhaps within your state to state or your country or whatever. So the key here is, as Dr. Rosario mentioned a minute ago, is communication. But so if you don't follow those paths, you're going to end up with poor planning and undoubtedly higher cost all along down the road. So scientists and groundwater managers don't have all the answers, but getting them together and having an open and frank dialogue will hopefully lead to sound and effective decisions that are needed. In negotiating surface water solutions for the Colorado River in the United States, I've seen scientists and lawyers and water managers get together from the two countries and from different states, and they were dealing with different perspectives in order to come to an agreement on how to manage the water. Ultimately, they had to focus on the obvious. They had to drop all of their biases, and then they had to focus on better understanding each other and the problem at hand. They had to become open-minded and question each other's, repeatedly, but they did so constructively, not destructively. One very important factor for groundwater scientists is to have the necessary financial resources. Scientists need the money to do the necessary research. And this is where groundwater managers can play a big role. They can find the funding necessary to help the scientists improve their information that they have. Adding a little bit to the focus, let me just move over, because there are a lot of problems scientists and groundwater managers deal with. But in the US, when groundwater managers and scientists are managing surface and groundwater, they must follow their respective state laws. When they're dealing with state-to-state issues, they're oftentimes by state agreements, state-to-state agreements. So there are compacts in place. But when you're attempting to enhance dialogue between countries, then you have to have a much more formal understanding and agreement between those two countries. In the United States, we do not have a federal agency that is charged with management of groundwater. This may be occurring in a lot of parts of the world. You have to have an authority that's responsible for that. Groundwater in the southwestern United States is managed by each individual state, while in the US and Mexico, we have conventions and treaties. Those are just international agreements that we've been following for many, many years. So that is probably one of the biggest obstacles. I've seen, as you go through and looking at these different situations around the world, you start to realize that it takes decades to come up with solutions. The International Boundary Water Commission, as Dr. Rivera mentioned, was formed in 1889 and was established in order to resolve surface water and boundary issues. It's 132 years ago. A lot has changed along the US-Mexico border. Populations have grown dramatically, and the need for groundwater has become much more apparent. There's a distinct difference between the US and Mexico on water management.
1 minute, Mr. Drusina, 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. There's a distinct difference between our two countries. US has state laws, Mexico has federal agency that covers it. So to wrap up, we need to enhance the dialogue between groundwater managers and scientists, but you got to do it in an open manner. You need people of authority at the table that are willing to make decisions and openly discuss issues without bias, without clouding the issue with bias. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you. And I think it all boils down to better communication will result in better management of our groundwater. Thank you very much, Dr. Rivera.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Trusina. And again, you're sharp. That's exactly the 6 minutes that you used. Before I forget, just to recall the public that the questions we are asking here, the 4 questions initially, are on the chat. So if you didn't catch up what the question was, you please go ahead and look at the chat. They're written there. From Mr. Trusina, there are many things to say. Of course, I only retain 3 of them. And this is absolutely in the sense of the question that enhance dialogue. So continue the enhancing dialogue. But one thing interesting that you mentioned, and we'll be back later, you said, and I quote you, it takes decades, tens of years. ISARM has 2 decades already, all right? So just keep that in mind. Right, that allows me to go into the next speaker for the 3rd question. And let me first ask the question because I forgot with you, Mr. Trusina. So the 3rd question is, how can we accelerate the transfer of transboundary science, transboundary aquifers science into policy? And to answer that, I will ask my colleague for a long time, Mr. Shami Puri, who was the Secretary General for many years of the International Association of Hydrogeologists. He is currently the Managing Director of Sustainable Solutions in Practical Hydrogeology. Shami has served 2 terms as Secretary General of the IAH. He was chair of the IAH Commission on the Transboundary Aquifers, actually something that I have to fill on myself now, very hard. His scientific, technical, and policy experience on groundwater resources management comes from over 4 decades of international work in 35 countries. So I thought if I could ask this question to somebody, that would certainly be Shami. So Shami, the floor is yours, and you will have, as everyone else, 6 minutes.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And well, thank you very much indeed. And I'm happy to be reminded of my age. I'm one of these elderly people who've been around for a long time. And for your information, I was in these particular rooms when the whole idea of transboundary aquifers was launched at the international scale. Let me just go to try and add to this very rich contributions that have come from our colleagues Rosario and Edward from the western part of the planet. There is the central part of the planet, so to speak, Europe and Africa, if you want to call them central, and the eastern part, which is the Asian continent. And there's quite a lot of differences over here, which I think we can look at the differences, but we can look at commonalities. So let me go straight to the question that you put to me. You say, how can we accelerate, that's the key word, how can we accelerate the transfer of transboundary science into policy? I would like to say, Alfonso, that perhaps we should first look at focusing on making policy formulation and its adoption more effective before we start to accelerate it. Because there may be different views around, but I think the policy formulation from science from science of transboundary aquifers to policy of transboundary aquifers is struggling at the moment to make that bit of a step. That's my kind of interpretation. And I go to the number of papers that are here in this conference, and I look at the papers from the 2010 conference, and there isn't, let me say, specific guidances coming from the 200 or so authors on, there are exceptions, but there aren't enough, on taking the science and transferring the book. What do I mean by that? Edward made the point, and I'll go back to it. We have to differentiate between the science of domestic aquifers versus transboundary aquifers, bearing in mind that by definition, an aquifer is transboundary simply because a domestic aquifer extends into another country. And a domestic aquifer, and I remind the wording, is the formation in which the water occurs and the water. Both of those extend from a country to another country. A domestic aquifer is then a transboundary aquifer. So it follows from that, quite logically, I think, that if the national policy in the domestic part of the aquifer is not particularly well science-based, it may or may not be, then the policy on transboundary aquifers will probably take the same features. So that's a conundrum that I think we need to face, and analysis around the world, and the analysis of the SDG 6.5.2 indicator that I listened to this morning was very interesting. A country and a neighboring country, one identifies the transboundary aquifer and claims to have an operational agreement on it. The neighboring country doesn't even recognize the aquifer. So, you know, here we have a conundrum. What is it that's happening over here when there are scientists on both sides? There are geologists on both sides, hydrogeologists on both sides. I'm sure that they've been over there and mapped it. And 50 years ago, the mapping used to stop at the national boundary. Today, we know that the geology extends beyond boundaries. So to make the findings of science more effective, I think that the practitioners of transboundary aquifer management and transboundary aquifer governance have to learn a language and use the language, I think, that policymakers use, because otherwise we are not getting through to them. And what are the kind of things that the policymakers want to understand? What they want to understand is this activity going to give us economic gains, or is it going to give us economic losses? If I undertake activity A, which is on the transboundary aquifer, policymaker doesn't quite know what it is, pump more wells, stop them, whatever it is, how does it affect the economy of the local area? How does it affect the local politics? If you try and stop the pumping, the local politicians are bound to stand up and say, well, I don't accept that. So that's the kind of thing that we need to understand. Countries at the policy level are looking to preserve their economic performance. They don't want to see losses, they want to see economic gains. So if we can present how the resources in a transboundary aquifer conducted under the umbrella of cooperation leads to the reduction of some kind of a risk. And that's what we need to do. That's the kind of area we need to get into from science to policy. I know it's a big step to take, but I think that's probably the way to go. And so looking at it is the policy going to help to reduce the risks associated with the livelihoods of people? That's what the policymaker wants to know. And will the national policy help to reduce or improve the relations with the neighboring country? If it does, that's a good thing. If it doesn't, it may not look right. And politically, we know that in many places in the world, there are tensions. And these tensions can be exploited using
You have 1 minute.
Natural resources.
Shami.
Yes, I have 5.43 seconds is where I'm at. Thank you very much. So what we need to be doing is just moving forward from translating transmissivity, storage coefficient, diffusion, you know, the flow of groundwater, the radioactive ages of this, into something like now, how many hectares of land is at risk? How many hundreds of villages are not going to have water if we don't cooperate in order to jointly manage? And there are examples, and I can give you some from the analysis that I've done in various places, including Stamford, where the mathematical model is showing certain things. And the policymaker wants to know, what does it mean? And in the case of Stamford, what it means is that for the central part of Namibia to be able to continue to abstract in Botswana, they need to start managing aquifer recharge. That needs to be transformed and transferred into policy language. 36 seconds. So thank you very much. I think I'll stop over there.
Thank you so much, Shami. For the sake of, I know you can go on and on, but it's for the sake of keeping the time. All right, so that leads me to the last question before we discuss the fourth question. And let me introduce you formally, Mr. Anders Jygerskog, which I hope I pronounced correctly. He is a senior, thank you. He's a senior water resources management specialist at the Global Water Practice with the World Bank, and its focal point for transboundary waters. Now, Anders' work has focused mainly on the Middle East and North Africa regions, covering East Africa and the Nile River. Previously, he was counselor for regional water resources in the MENA region with the Swedish Embassy in Amman, Jordan, and director of knowledge services at the Stockholm International Water Institute, SIWI, as we all know, where he headed the transboundary water management unit. And when I invited him and saw his curricula, I thought, well, I guess a four key question will be on the facilitation, because he has the experience. So the question for Mr. Jygerskog is, how can institutions facilitate the negotiation, diplomacy, and scientific cooperation between riparian countries needed for political commitment and institutional strengthening. And again, you have the floor for six minutes. Anders?
Yes, thank you very much, Alfonso. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. It's a pleasure and an honor to be invited to such a distinguished panel. I had some points that I wanted to make, but just listening to the previous speakers, I think I wanted to add, but I will try to restrain myself and keep myself to the 6 minutes. I will come at this question, and really it centers around, I think the keyword here is facilitation of cooperation. That's really what I would like to center my contribution on here today. And I'm coming at it from sort of the development bank perspective, but also from my more perhaps scientific or educational background, which is more international relations and political science. So coming at that questions from that perspective. So let me first start with the first point then. I mean, just highlighting that the World Bank just did a stock-taking exercise of our transboundary engagement, broadly speaking, for the last couple of decades. Also with that, based on that, devising a new strategy. One of the 5 sort of not necessarily new areas, but areas we want to focus on is exactly transboundary groundwater and transboundary aquifers. We recognize that this is something that we have supported, but we need to support it even more as basins are closing, as pressure grows on these resources. I wanted to highlight that first, and then my second point is, and I think all of you, other speakers, and also the conference at large talks about this. What is known, what is not known, and I think that's an important contribution of national institutions to help policymakers, help the transboundary discussion, to bring more knowledge and science to really understand what happens. And I think Shami, Ed, and Rosario as well, they already mentioned that as one of the key important aspects that science can help with. The third point, and that goes to, I think Rosaria was talking about that, sort of the power relations, the willingness to share data, which is not always there. Transboundary waters, whether it's a rivers, whether it's aquifers, and data around those are often treated, especially if you're in a region which is perhaps, more heavily focused on security issues, where there are conflicts, there is less likelihood of wanting to share these data. And that this I think is common, whether it's transboundary groundwater or whether it's rivers. And so that's a challenge. And scientific institutions in countries, and we've seen initiatives on this, perhaps where there isn't a formal cooperation between the countries, can come together, usefully engage on a scientific level. And I think Ed highlighted the fact, try to put aside whatever perspectives that you may have, and really look at it scientifically. I think that has been helpful if we look back on the World Bank's engagement and at starting dialogues. You often take science together, and scientists from different countries. You do get a common understanding, you have a common language, you may have differences and you may debate those on a scientific level. But if you can do that, you can slowly, and I think it was mentioned it takes decades to form cooperation, and I agree, I couldn't agree more. But slowly you can build that cooperation if the space is given to scientists to work this out. And then finally, what we've seen in transboundary cooperation, broadly speaking, whether it's rivers, whether it's aquifers, is that when science and policymakers comes together, that there is a network, that's a social capital, if you like, that is being built between those that are engaging, and over time, it's trust being built. And I think we can look at almost any engagement that we've been a part of, often starting with very little cooperation, perhaps even not willing to be in the same room. But over time, a network, a trust, a common understanding based on science often has emerged, and that takes decades. And I think that's what can, in the long run, also facilitate this cooperation that we wanted to see. So I'll stop there, hopefully within time, Alfonso, and happy to take any follow-up questions as well. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks to you, Anders. Actually, you were under your time, so highly appreciated. You know, it's it's so rich. You guys have done a spectacular job here. I'm taking notes as you speak, and at the same time paying attention. It's hard. There's so many things, and unfortunately, we don't have the time to discuss. I would have liked to cross-examine each one of you, you know, between you, among you, but unfortunately, there's no time. We're going to have to make another conference out of this. Instead, we will follow the protocol and go for the questions, if there are any from the public. And then I will also have my own questions that I'd like to ask you. Let's hope for the best in the next 10 minutes or so. I see already one question very specific to Shami. I guess you provoke people here. So Shami, somebody in the public is asking, since there are high level of uncertainty with groundwater, even with the best monitoring systems in place, so what principles should water-related policymakers use to balance what we know and the risk of what we don't know as they allocate water resources? Actually, it goes very close to some of the things that Rosario already mentioned at the beginning. Shami, what do you say?
Well, thank you very much indeed. This issue of risk and converting the science into risk-based envelopes is exactly the way ahead. There is a session immediately after this panel in which there is a discussion on this, where we make some points on how the risks should be addressed. To try and answer the question, I won't mention the aquifer that I'm going to be talking about, but way back in 1991 or thereabouts, there was an aquifer which is a transboundary aquifer, and the word transboundary wasn't very important, very forefront in it, although everybody knew about it in this country, and there was a great risk. The foreign country is taking all this water from our aquifer. What are we going to do about it? And we urgently need this water because we're running out of water. So the question was put to myself and my team that we were working. And what we did to try and respond to these risks was first construct a mathematical model. That was built on the basis of 18,000 meters of new water well drilling, about 7,000 hours of pumping testing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of mathematical modeling, lots of science, 4 or 5 years worth of science, mathematical model. Mathematical model was then used to predict a series of scenarios, risk-based. And the risks were yield from the aquifer, the potential of the impact to the well fields in the foreign country. How long will it take? What is the likelihood of the impact? All of these risks were converted into numbers and figures that were presented to this particular government. So the answer was, if you take X, Y, Z decision on drilling so many wells for pumping for so many years, the impact of this is going to be this much drawdown approximately in so-and-so country. Here's your risk. So that's the way to go ahead. Scientists have got to move out of constructing the mathematical model, sitting back and saying, oh, here's a model. Yeah, all right, what about it? What does the model tell us? The model tells the policymaker, if you make this decision, Mr. Minister or Mr. President, the impact of this is going to be so much on your economy, positive or negative or whatever it is. So I would say that the way ahead for us scientists is to move into this realm where decision makers need information which is quantitative within risk envelopes. We're not all perfect. I mean, our forecast won't be 100%, but it'll be 60% or 70%. And we can improve that by saying, well, I need 3 more observation wells.
Thank you so much, Shami, also for the time that is short. Again, there are many other questions. I don't see, it's hard for me to see on the screen here, but I think from the public, I don't see one. Yeah, here's one. This is a little bit long. I read it, and I'm gonna read it, and I'm gonna ask anybody want to say something. but it is a little bit general. I don't see any specifics in the question, but let me read it. So the question that this person asked to this panel is science has its good and its bad, and its experiments and applications. A little bit of philosophy. Can we have science that benefits humanity positively and avoid science that hurt? I don't read everything that hurt. One, to avoid science benefits. Okay, benefits for creating enabler environment for human existence, not destructive to human existence. It's hard to say, but I guess what I take from this question is, again, the role of science. And this has been discussed here at length. So unless I see somebody would like to react to this question specifically, please do so. Otherwise, not really. Okay, Shami, can you do that something brief?
I'll make a quick response.
Okay.
Science for good, science for bad. COVID came along, and everybody said, "Oh, what are we going to do?" The scientists got together, and within weeks, months, with collaboration around the planet, all medical scientists got together, and within a few weeks, humanity had cracked the answer, and we have a vaccine. Luckily, many of us have had the vaccine. Unfortunately, many of us have not. That's not the role of science. That's the role of politicians. So the scientists have produced the results. Regrettably, to me, the policymakers have not had the responsibility of making the same vaccine available equally around the planet. So scientists have done their job. Scientists are still fretting that this vaccine is not being distributed around the world, but that's a very, very obvious answer to the question that's been made. Science will produce the good, and it's the policymaker to take it forward.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Shami. That was indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Let me just add to that very good response. I see science as a foundational element to any kind of decision that is being made by people that are rational and reasonable. So that is really the fundamental part of this. You have to use science in an equitable and in a way that matters to all people that are involved, in a way that they can understand what is the fundamental principles that went into making the decision. And so science is foundational. It is the foundation that we should try to build from, although there are a lot of factors that can cloud issues that are being developed. But in essence, that's how I would respond to that question.
Thank you, Mr. Troshina. It's very hard for me to evaluate which question should go next. I have a list of at least 4 or 5 coming up. This one is for actually to follow up to Anders. So I will do it in a quick way. And he said, the person asked, well, he doesn't really ask, but he's saying that following your talk, there are also open to ways to build trust and social capital in other areas, but highlighting, in your case, South Asia for the extra political challenges there. Anders, do you have something to say to that?
Okay. Thank you very much for the questions. Yes, I saw it in the chat. I think, I mean, the overall response would be that there are no easy answers to this. Building social capital and networks and all of that, it takes time. I think when the World Bank engages, and I think when everyone engages as an outside partner, one should do that with a long-term view, supporting a cooperation. And I think that's the only way to go about it, is engage with a long-term view, invite the scientists, get them to work together across boundaries, but also importantly with the policymakers to try to build that social capital. But again, it takes time. It'll take decades, as Ed was highlighting very correctly.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, this is really a pity. I feel very bad about it. We don't have time. There's about 30 seconds left before we move on. So I won't ask another question. I'll just wrap it up and saying that thank you so much. And the keywords that we heard today related to 4 things: contribution, enhancing, accelerating, and exploring. So you cover them, guys. Thank you so much indeed. And I just keep in mind, although I will write my notes and do something more sense about it, I keep in mind a few things. One, a paradigm change that Rosario told us about, the engineering point of view, in other words, outcomes driven, which is a very practical way of seeing things, enhancing with institutions, generation and language have to change, and we have to adapt to policymakers. So my thinking is, okay, so maybe the science, putting all together, maybe we begin by looking at what is needed in a given point to the type of science that is outcome driven that we could do eventually. And the last thing is, yes, indeed, whether it is national, domestic, or transboundary, is the same aquifer. It's always the same issues. It doesn't recognize boundaries. However, I'm asking myself, I don't want an answer. I'm just saying, is it because it's local or national, it doesn't follow or cannot have the tragedy of commons? And I leave it at that. Thank you again so much. You will hear from us, and your names will appear in some quotes as well. Thank you again, Shami, Rosario, Mr. Rosina, Edward, and Anders. So much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alfonso.
Thank you very much.